Have you ever wondered what you would see if you lived on a boat for a week in the Bahamas and dove 4 times a day? Well, I did. So I went to Nassau and I jumped on Blackbeard's Liveaboard to find out. I was plenty and incredibly surprised. The first night was spent sailing out to the Exumas, a series of small islands on the edge of the Bahamas, and the next morning we got up and got right to it. The week includes 18 different dives and took us to 14 different dive sites. We got to experience different ocean habitats including wall dives, swim-throughs, blue holes, and even shipwrecks. We also got to do 4 night dives on this trip, where the dive you would do in the afternoon was also the dive you would do at night. Even though it was the last dive we did, the first thing I want to talk about is the blue hole. Blue holes are big draws in other parts of the world, and this one was quite the experience and my first blue hole dive ever. The lip of the hole sits at about 40 feet underwater, or about 13 meters, and we went down to a max depth of 90 feet or 27, even though the hole itself goes down well below 250 feet. And on top of that, at about 70 feet down, or 22 meters, there's a small cave just large enough for one diver to explore comfortably. It's a simple in and out, in and overhead environment, so you do have to be a little bit careful, but it's plenty big enough to swim in, turn around 180 degrees, and swim back out. It doesn't go in very far and there's no opportunity to really get lost or anything like that, so it's pretty safe to do, but definitely still a place you want to make sure that you're comfortable and in control going into. Another one of the biggest draws to diving in this area are the wall dives and the swim-throughs. The deepest we went on this trip was about 100 feet or 30 meters. However, it's very easy for deep certified divers to go a little bit beyond that down to their max depth of about 40 meters or 130 feet. What I really loved about diving on these walls was just how many swim-throughs ended up spitting you out onto the deep blue. You start your swim-through on the shallow side and make your way down deeper to the exit. This makes it so that you should really focus on doing these at the beginning of your dive when your air reserves and your no deco limits are at their most conservative. The other thing that's kind of a weird benefit about these swim-throughs is that compared to other places in the world, like Cozumel for example, is that many of these swim-throughs are pretty void of life. What that means is that it's a really good place to practice your buoyancy control in a partially closed overhead environment. This does not mean that you don't have to be careful. Keep in mind that other divers will be coming through these areas as well after you, and so kicking up the bottom is kind of frowned upon and may make other divers not really want to be your dive buddy on the next subsequent dives. However, what it also does is that it relieves some of the pressure that you may have exploring some of these swim-throughs in other places where you really have to be careful about all the life. You also get to explore a few wrecks while you're aboard this liveaboard, that being a plane and a small ship. The plane is quite shallow and we explored it both during the day and the night, whereas the boat is actually a hub for tons of sharks, which is another huge draw for diving in the Bahamas. The plane was an interesting dive site and has kind of an interesting history. That being said, it was thought that this plane used to be a drug plane for Pablo Escobar. Now, whether or not that is true is a little bit unclear, but one thing that I'm sure about is that this wreck does hold plenty of life. Specifically interesting to me are all the lionfish. Day and night, these fish are actually crawling all over the wreck. The shipwreck, on the other hand, while home to many sharks, is also home to a variety of different life, some of which I actually only saw on the wreck, that being sand divers, as well as big balls of anchovies that actually found their home inside of the ship. My favorite, however, was this Nassau grouper. Up until this point, I've really only been able to photograph and film Graysby groupers in the Barbados, and so this Nassau grouper kind of opened my eyes to just how many other species of groupers that do exist, and served as a really good reminder that I do have to always be brushing up on my fish ID skills. This trip had many of the charismatic creatures that we all love. I know I've mentioned that there were a lot of sharks, but did I mention the sharks? In fact, sharks made an appearance on almost every dive we went on, whether that was right when you jumped in, on the reef, or even while hanging out at your safety stop. Who doesn't like to spend 3 minutes at 15 feet with a bunch of Caribbean reef sharks swimming around? Also, these sharks were not necessarily afraid after a while to get up and close and check you out. We also had a couple encounters with different turtles, and while not necessarily as abundant as in other places in the world that I've been, the experiences that we actually had were actually really, really cool. And obviously you can't forget your nighttime favorites, whether those are wild encounters with octopus hunting on the reef, or just southern stingrays kind of slowly gliding in the gloom. I mean, I've already made my case as to why night dives I think are some of my favorites, but to a trained eye, you definitely get to start appreciating a lot of the unique behaviors that you don't necessarily see during the day. But it's not always just about the charismatic creatures. In fact, I like to propose that Every dive has something cool to look for, even if you don't see any of the big species. You know, sometimes all it takes is this school of horse-eye jacks that swim and engulf you in the water column to make you really feel like you're part of that school. Or you might come across really tiny gems that most people would swim right by. This is a coral scorpionfish, which is in the same family as the lionfish and other scorpionfish, but this particular species actually only grows to about an inch and a half. I have never photographed or filmed this species, and I actually didn't even know it existed up until the point where I got back and started looking at different scorpionfish to come to realize that it's a species brand new to me. A tiny little friend that is as potent as he is adorable. That isn't where the adorable friends end though either, as for the first time in my life I got to spend a lot of time with one of my favorite species, the yellowheaded jawfish. These fish spend their day protecting their little burrows and can always be found either just hovering right above the hole or with their head sticking out. Their ability to swim backwards right back into their home is actually kind of unbelievable, and it never gets old to watch. These are only a few of the unique species that I actually got to encounter, and definitely not an exhaustive list. There were a ton of new fish to me to be able to film and photograph. Spadefish, cero fish, and more were all species that I got to film for the first time. Oh, and did I mention that I had my 200th dive aboard the Liveaboard? They knew exactly how we should celebrate that. The diving was pretty interesting, and overall I had a lot of unique and first-time experiences on this Liveaboard. 18 dives and over 15 hours underwater meant a relaxing vacation that wasn't so relaxing, but it was definitely worth the time, money, and energy. I will definitely be revisiting Blackbeard's very soon.